Everyone. I'll start with just a very big framework to understand and then go specifically to the issue of the so-called right of return, which, as I'll explain, is neither a right, it's not sanctioned in international law, and at this point, it's certainly not a return. So broadly speaking, to understand the 20th century politically, it's actually quite simple. The 20th century is about the political transition from empires to nation states. We begin the 20th century when much of the earth is divided between empires, and we end the 20th century when much of the earth, almost all of it, is divided between nation states. Whatever ideas existed in the early 20th century about replacing empires with mandates, autonomies, multi-autonomies, all kinds of systems. The national system established after World War II is clearly based on the idea of the sovereignty of nations and of the sovereignty of states. This is fundamental to the UN Charter and basically the whole international legal system, which is based on treaties between sovereign states that are signatories to treaties. But the central unit of legitimacy in the international system established in the wake of empires is the fundamental importance and the basic legitimacy of the state unit, which generally is based as a nation state on the self-determination of peoples. Zionism, of course, is a part of that, and partition is based in many ways actually on the Jewish desire for a state. Again, by the mid-20th century, the Zionist movement is very clear that it wants a state, a fully sovereign state, which is why in 1947, when the British are explaining why they are giving up the mandate was a kind of compromise system that Britain was responsible for until the Jews achieved sovereignty. Britain is reneging on the mandate and giving it back to the United Nations, which is the legal heir of the League of Nations. And Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister at the time, says the following. He says, why are they giving up on the mandate? Why are they getting out? His Majesty's government has come to the conclusion that there's an irreconcilable conflict. Basically, he says in the land, the conflict is irreconcilable. Why? He says there's two peoples. There's Jews, there's Arabs. What do the Jews want? What is the top priority? They call it the point of principle. He says the Jews want a state. So again, it's very clear. There's no ambiguity. The Jews want a state. What does he say the Arabs want? The Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. And this is the core of the conflict. And basically has been the best predictor of the behavior of both sides ever since. The top priority for the Zionist movement is a state, which is why the Zionist movement says yes to partition, even though the Jewish state is going to be without Zion, without Jerusalem, and without Judea, without the cradle of Jewish civilization. And the Arabs say no to partition because it frustrates their top priority of having no Jewish state in any borders. So even though it provides the Arabs with a state, given that this is not their top priority, they reject partition, and they reject it violently. And they make it very clear that this is their purpose. Their purpose is to subdue Zionism, to ensure that there is no Jewish state in any borders whatsoever. So war ensues in the wake of partition. Partition, as the United Nations envisioned and proposed, is never implemented. And in the wake of the war, as we saw in the maps, the state of Israel emerges as a fully sovereign, independent state with more territory than was given to it in partition. And the Arab state does not emerge as an independent state. Rather, the West Bank comes under full Jordanian control, it's annexed, and the Gaza Strip comes under Egyptian occupation. Now, in the course of the war, what happens is that people move. This happened in all wars. This is why I began with the broader framework of the transition from empires to nation state. This 20th century transition from empires to nation state was bloody. It involved 2 world wars. It involved many civil wars. This was a very bloody transition, which is why all nation states were born in one way or another in violence. And it involved, in almost all cases, population movements, population transfer, population movements. We have it, of course, all across Europe, Asia, the Indian subcontinent, later in Africa. This is a feature of the transition from empire to nation state, and the same happens here. Jews are pushed out of the lands that become Arab, and many Arabs flee to the Arab side. Some are expelled towards the end of the war, but many remain. As a result, Israel is born as a sovereign Jewish state with a substantial Arab minority. Palestine is stillborn. It's not born as a sovereign state, and there are no Jews in the areas that come under Arab control. The Arabs who flee or are expelled in the course of war become refugees. Again, this is not unique. Any effort to present it as somehow unique, in the book, The War of Return, we compare the numbers, we compare the process. There is absolutely nothing unique in the Arabs becoming refugees as a result of war that is a transition from an imperial era to a nation state era. Nothing unique, not in the numbers, not in the intensity, nothing special about it. What is special is that unlike all other refugees from this process, the Palestinians are uniquely indulged in allowing themselves to maintain themselves as refugees over decades and through the generations. All other refugees, Muslim, Hindus, Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, basically sent a very harsh message. Don't look back. Yes, it's tragic. You lost your homes, but that's it. You build a new life wherever you are or somewhere else, but you don't go back. The only conditions where refugees went back is the country is a situation where typically they had the same ethnic makeup of the country, and the country wanted them. So Poles to Poland, Ukrainians to Ukraine, and of course Jews to Israel. Israel, as soon as it's sovereign, it opens its gates. Jewish refugees from all across Europe, displaced persons camps, and of course from the Arab world, as the Jews are expelled from the Arab world in revenge for the victory of Israel. A lot of refugees are accepted into countries where they have the same ethnic makeup as the majority. But other than that, if countries, again, remember, the system is based on the sanctity of the sovereignty of states. If states don't want refugees back, they are not forced to. So there's no right of return in defiance of the sovereign will of a state. So any notion that such a right exists, it does not. So all refugees are basically told, tough, but move on. And that's what they do. They build new lives wherever they are. And the reason that the message is that refugees do not return home unless their country, the new country wants them, is simply because it's understood that this would be war forever. If Germans can go back to the Sudeten and into Poland and Ukrainians and Bulgarians and Greeks and Turks, the understanding is clearly that if there's refugee return, it's going to be war forever. which is why there is no right of return for refugees to sovereign states who don't want them. That right is just not enshrined. But the Palestinians demand return. Why do the Palestinians demand return? The Palestinians demand return not for like the innocent sense that we have, yeah, they just want to go back to their homes. Of course, some of that is true, but mostly because it's created as a political tool to continue the war. And again, it's very clear, refugee return equals continued war. And that's exactly what the Palestinians want. They want to continue the war. In their perspective, the fact that Israel is established as a state is merely a temporary aberration. This is why all the Arab countries refused to make peace with Israel in 1948. They merely agreed to sign a ceasefire agreement, basically indicating that the war will continue. And keeping the refugees unsettled is part of continuing the war. As a side note, Jordan was the one country that was willing to make peace with Israel. And it is also the one country that did not demand return. Jordan naturalized all the Palestinian refugees. Basically, Jordan, including the annexed West Bank, was home to about 70% of the Arab refugees. And it naturalized them. And when you naturalize a refugee, they're no longer a refugee, they're a citizen. And Jordan declared its willingness to make peace with Israel. And of course, a Palestinian extremist assassinated the king of Jordan over this issue. And ever since, Jordan has been very squeamish about it. An organization is created, UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, to help settle the Arab refugees. There's nothing special about UNRWA in the beginning. UNRWA is a temporary organization created to deal with the refugees. Just so you know that it's not special, a similar organization is created for the Korean refugees at the same time, UNCRA. This is the same era, the early 50s. UNCRA is a huge success. Within several years, it settles 2 million Korean refugees. They do not return. It settles them in the new place in South Korea. It does so for a fraction of the budget that UNRWA gets. And within a few short years, it's closed. It's a temporary agency. It achieved its goals. And look at South Korea today. UNRWA was supposed to do the same thing for the Arab refugees, help settle them mostly in Jordan, where they were, Syria, Lebanon. It was given a lot of money from the US and the UK to do so. But the Palestinians themselves and the Arab countries refuse resettlement. And when the US and the UK want to close down UNRWA because it's useless, and they knew that it was useless already in the 50s, the Arab countries basically threatened the West to keep UNRWA alive, essentially telling them, you already made the mistake of supporting partition, of supporting Jewish self-determination. Do not make that mistake again. And as a result, from that moment on, the West continues to fund UNRWA in something that could only be described as a bribe or as a protection racket, basically paying a bribe to the mob so as to appease the Arab world. We know from all documents at the time, they know that UNRWA is useless, but they keep it alive, hopefully to appease the Arab world. And as a result, generation after generation, an ever ballooning number of people are called refugees. Now, just to understand international law, the problem with international law is that UNRWA has a loophole. When the UN High Commissioner for Refugees was created, the Arab countries understood that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees has the purpose of ending the refugee status of refugees, right? That's the idea. They didn't want that. So they secured a loophole for UNRWA, where basically whatever UNRWA decides is international law, but it's not international law, it's Palestinian law. Basically, so if UNRWA decides that Palestinians are refugees for the third generation, that's their situation, even though comparable norms in international law would mean they're not refugees. Just so you get a sense, 40% of those registered today by UNRWA as refugees, nearly 5.5 million, 40% of them are citizens of the state of Jordan. Most of them have been born in Jordan, never displaced by war. Nowhere in the world is someone a refugee when they're a citizen for another country. Another 40% live in the West Bank and Gaza. Whether the West Bank and Gaza are the state of Palestine or not, it's clear that the people who live there are not going to be settled anywhere else. So they're already settled in place. They're not refugees, and most of them have not been displaced by war because it's the second, third, fourth, and fifth generation now. A very small group who live in Syria and Lebanon. We know from census that most of them have left. So they too are not refugees. They're citizens of the US, of Germany, and the few, about 200, 300,000 that remain in Syria and Lebanon, who were never given citizenship, who are stateless, but they're not first generation refugees. Those people need to be resettled by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So we need to understand that the number of Palestinians who would truly be considered either stateless or displaced or refugees is several tens of thousands, 200, 300,000 at most. It's a small number, definitely compared with the mythical number of millions and millions of Palestinian refugees. So the Palestinians are not refugees according to international norms, but it's not international law because UNRWA has this loophole where whatever UNRWA decides is just okay. And finally, just a word on 194. Palestinians often quote the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194 as giving them a right of return. Read the resolution. It doesn't speak of rights. It is a program for making peace following the war in 1949. Of course, it was rejected by Arab countries because part of it was recognizing Israel. It is a United Nations General Assembly resolution. UNGA resolutions, even if there's 3,000 of them, do not create international law. International law is based on treaties or United Nations Security Council, but not the General Assembly. So the General Assembly can say again and again, as it just did a couple of days ago, that the Palestinians have a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. They don't. It's just not a right that is sanctioned in international law. The day that the Palestinians will have their own state, they can have, like Israel has, they can have a law of return, a domestic immigration law, like every country has, that privileges one group in entry and citizenship. The Palestinians can have a law of immigration that privileges Palestinians, that they can do, but they definitely do not possess, either individually or collectively, the right to settle inside the sovereign territory of the state of Israel. So the right of return is neither a right, and given that by now, most of the people who claim it have not been displaced by war, it's neither a return as well.
Thank you very much, Einat. It was very interesting. Loud and clear, we received your message and